Hello and welcome back to Science of Medicine. Today I want to talk about the reproductive system. This is a very important system as it is necessary for us to survive as a species. Now, in order to talk about the reproductive system, I have to talk about changes that occur in each one of us as we move through puberty. And so I'll start off talking about those changes so that we understand what is necessary to be able to have reproduction. So first off, we talk about secondary sexual characteristics that develop as we go through puberty. And I show here pictures of both a man and a woman that have already gone through those changes. Now, these developmental changes, or these development of secondary sexual characteristics, occur under the influence of testosterone for men or estrogen for women. And they include things such as maturation of the genitalia, which we'll talk about in detail in a little bit. For women, the development of their breasts, which will serve the function that when they give birth to a child, that will be a way of providing nutrition. There'll be the development of hair. Now for males, this will be more broad across the body than the female, particularly on the hair, on the chest, on the back, on the face, and also in the pelvic region. Now, we develop, when we go through puberty, what is called an escutcheon, which is a hair pattern that depends upon whether we are male or female. The male escutcheon extends from the genitalia outward to the edge of the hips and then upwards to the umbilicus, to the belly button. So it forms a triangular shape, whereas the female escutcheon will be triangular in shape. It will go up to the level of the hip, much like a bikini kind of cut. Muscles will develop much more prominently for male. Bones, the growth plates, will fuse, and as they fuse, they will then limit the size that the person can be. There will be changes in particular in the stature. In general, men will be taller than women. The hips will also expand to allow for the cervical area to be able to pass a large head of a child. There will be changes in the voice. The vocal cords will actually be such that the male voice will be much deeper. And of course, we all have the common experience, having been through puberty, that acne and the overactiveness of our sebaceous glands on our body will actually occur. Now, in doing so, I also want to talk about genetic and phenotypic. So genotype, whether I have XX or XY, if I were a male, XX for a female, and then I've just described phenotypical changes. These are two poles, if you will, on a continuum of varying degrees. There are other genotypes that I do not talk about in Science of Medicine yet, and those then can provide phenotypical changes that are somewhere on that spectrum between phenotypically female versus phenotypically male. Now, as I mentioned, both estrogen and testosterone are the key hormones here. Estrogen for women, and those will come from the ovaries, and testosterone, which will come from the testes. And they're stimulated in a negative feedback loop by FSH and LH, two anterior pituitary hormones. And this is important to understand because if you have exogenous, that is, if you were taking testosterone or estrogen and it was not being made by either the testes or the ovaries, this will have a negative feedback effect on your own production. You may recall when we talked about the adrenal glands that both testosterone and estrogens are part of the steroid synthetic hormone pathway. We talked about before cortisol and aldosterone, but you can see down below that androgens are also synthesized from that cholesterol using different enzymes. And in this case, you will actually have things in the testes which will be present that will not be present in the ovaries and vice versa. So let's talk some more about anatomy, starting with females. If I look at the breast anatomy, this is a pictorial representation of a breast. You can see that after it has developed post-puberty, that there are various areas that contain lobules which will be used to produce milk to nurture an infant. And this will travel through a ductal system to a developed nipple, which will then allow for the child to take nutrients. There is also fat that is in the breast tissue, and underneath that are the pectoralis muscles and then the chest wall. On the anatomy side, here is a pictorial depiction of female reproductive anatomy. And I need to tell you a little bit more about general anatomy to be able for this to make sense. This is a cutaway view of this, and you can see that anterior towards the front, you have the bladder, which is there. And there is a small opening, which is the urethra, which will actually then go to the outside, which will be just below the clitoris, which we'll talk about in a second. Behind or inferior to this will be the opening to the vagina. And the vagina actually will then go back to an opening which is called the cervix. And the cervix will then allow entrance into the uterus. Now the uterus is going to be where a developing embryo will be implanted if the person is pregnant. And the ovaries that I mentioned before, which are producing estrogen, are actually connected to the uterus via what are called the fallopian tubes, which I'll talk about. Now, further back, I have the rectum with the anus. So there are three holes in looking at the female. One is the urethra, the other is the vagina, and the other is the anus. If I look at this from a different perspective, you see that the uterus and the vagina here, you can see that fallopian tubes, or what they call uterine tubes in this diagram, sort of envelop the ovaries. And it's not a sealed area. In fact, the distal ends, the ends that are closest to the ovaries, have what are called these finger-like fimbriae, which will help move the ovulated egg into that uterine tube and down into the uterus. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. If I look at the frontal side, you can see both the urethra as well as the vaginal opening, and then you can see towards the back, which is listed here, where the anus will actually be located. If I take what's called a speculum and place this into the vaginal vault, then you see the third picture on the bottom right that shows the cervix. And in the very center of the cervix, this is called the os. This is the hole, the entrance into the uterus. And this is actually where we also take samples for screening for cervical cancer, for example. Now, if I look in detail at the uterus, I find that the uterus is made up of three levels. The outermost layer, which is in the abdominal cavity proper, is covered by the perimetrium. I then have a very thick muscle wall, which is called the myometrium. This is smooth muscle. It is not under your conscious control if you're a female. And then the inside is lined with what is called the endometrium. During reproductive years, the female will actually grow and then shed this endometrial lining if there is no intrauterine pregnancy. You can see the fallopian tube, which is fairly thin, with the fimbriae that envelop the ovaries, which actually are tethered to the uterus by a ligament. You also see at the bottom end the cervix in cross section with that opening that goes into the uterus proper. So, once we move through puberty, on the female reproductive cycle, until they hit menopause, about every month, there will be a process of ovulation or release of eggs from an ovary. And so what will happen is that somewhere at the beginning of this process, anywhere from perhaps 10 or so eggs will begin to develop. Now you're born with all the eggs that you're ever going to have when you're at birth. So every female, all the eggs that she has will be present at birth. But this maturation of some of them will occur as each month goes on. We don't really understand why certain eggs will begin to mature at any given time, but it does happen. One, generally, of these will be dominant in its maturation process. Sometimes you can have multiple ones, which is why you can have twins or triplets or multiple births. So as this egg matures, it is maturing under the influence of estrogen. And this is called the follicular phase, or the follicle. Now this follicle, as it develops, then will eventually get to a point where it will erupt from the ovary. That is called ovulation. And then that egg will then travel down the fallopian tube and into the uterus. If a sperm meets with that egg and fertilization occurs, then that resulting zygote will become an embryo, and that can implant on the uterine wall and become a child. The leftover fragment of that erupted follicle then will become what is called the corpus luteum. Now, although we conceptually say that this process of maturation and going through a menstrual cycle is traditionally 28 days, in fact, it is not normally 28 days. It is a range of days. It could be as many as in the mid-30s, and each female tends to have a cycle which is similar in terms of length. That being said, that if you are of reproductive age and you miss a cycle, it is important that you also will check and make sure that you are not pregnant, because that is the most common reason for people in reproductive age who miss a cycle to actually to have pregnancy occur, and that's why they've missed that cycle. So the follicular phase, I'm having this cohort of perhaps 10 or 15 eggs that will start to develop. These follicles will start to develop. One of them normally, but could be multiple, will actually beat the others to the finish line, if you will, and erupt. And that process is ovulation. That remnant will become the corpus luteum, and that will become important if there is an intrauterine pregnancy. Now, let's go through estrogen-dependent follicular phase, and let's go and see what happens after the egg erupts and goes down in the fallopian tube. Now you can see from the bottom graph on the left that the estrogen level drops down precipitously, but the progesterone starts to actually rise. And the progesterone is rising to support the uterine lining, the endometrium. It is dependent upon progesterone, or a mimic, which we'll talk about in a second. And as that develops, it's developing in anticipation that there will be a fertilized egg which will be implanted in the uterus. If that does not happen, then the progesterone level, when it falls, will cause the sloughing off of that endometrium in preparation for the next cycle. And that's what's referred to as the period, or the menstrual cycle. Now, if pregnancy occurs, beta-HCG, which is the molecule that is actually detected in pregnancy tests, is secreted to support that corpus luteum, which will produce progesterone to support the endometrial lining. And then if not, then this process will repeat as you shed the lining and then go back through. Now on the male side, I have a cutaway view here that shows two holes. I have a hole, or an opening, that comes out from the urethra from the penis, and you can see this at the very tip over here on the penis marked as the meatus. And then I also have a hole which is from the anus, which is from the gastrointestinal tract. Now, in addition to the penis, which is going to be used as a delivery system for the sperm, which are the male equivalent of the egg. They're the haploid cells that will then fertilize the egg. They will come from the testes, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And they'll come through a ductal system. So I will produce sperm in the testis. They'll be stored in the epididymis, which is this structure that's on the back side of the testes. And the testes are distended in a scrotal sac from the rest of the body, as spermatogenesis won't occur at the very warm temperature of inside the body, so the testes are descended from that. The epididymis is also connected then through that vas deferens through a series of ducts that go through what's called the prostate gland. Now, the prostate gland is going to be where there will be a mixing of that of those sperm with other things, nutrients and what have you, to create semen, and then that semen will then be able to ejaculate or be propelled through the urethral opening. Now, there are several parts to the penis that facilitate this. There is the shaft. The shaft is made up of a spongy vascular tissue, which is called the corpus cavernosum, and this can, under the influence of nitric oxide, engorge with blood to become erect. I also have the glans, which is the outer portion from the precipice all the way to the tip of the penis. In the top, I have an uncircumcised penis. In the bottom, a circumcised penis. And this will facilitate transfer of sperm to the female. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. All right, so let's talk about how men will produce their contribution to an infant, and that is done through spermatogenesis. Now, in the male, the hormone that is appropriate is testosterone, and it's secreted by Leydig cells, okay? And they're located in the interstitium of these testes. Now, the testosterone, as I said, is essential for secondary sexual characteristic maturation, but it's also necessary for the growth and division of the germ cells that will create the sperm. Luteinizing hormone stimulates these Leydig cells to secrete the testosterone, as I mentioned, under a negative feedback system. Now, FSH stimulates Sertoli cells, which I'll talk about in just a second, and these cells are necessary to develop, to nurture the sperm as they're developing. As I mentioned, as the sperm then are developed, they're stored in the epididymis and then transferred via the vas deferens. You may have heard of a procedure called a vasectomy, which is to cut the vas deferens so that the sperm actually don't have a conduit for getting through. So when I create these sperm, which happens on an ongoing basis from puberty until a male dies, I will have these diploid sperm, which then have to undergo meiosis 1 and 2 to create the haploid. So the DNA that is necessary for the male to put into the sperm, into the head, will be a haploid, just like the egg will be haploid. Now, the egg for the female will contain an X chromosome. The DNA for the male could create contain an X or a Y, and therefore it is determining whether that child will be genotypically male or female based upon the male sperm that happens to actually meet with the egg. The sperm, as I said, will be stored in the epididymis. It will be comprised of a head, a mid-body, and a tail. The tail will be able to rotate in order to propel the sperm forward. All right, So let's talk about how this process actually occurs. For the male part, stimulation has both sensory input as well as mental stimulation. Testosterone is what drives the desire for sexual contact. This process of stimulation is under the control of the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and relaxation nervous system. And during this process, the corpora cavernosa will become engorged. As I mentioned, this is mediated by nitric oxide, and as I said, under the control of the parasympathetic nervous system. This will allow blood to flow into the corpora cavernosa, but not flow out. It will become engorged, and this will allow for better delivery. There will be lubrication that will be provided by secretions from the bulbourethral and urethral glands that are going to come out through the urethra. And as I mentioned, the sperm is stored in the epididymis and then moved into the vas deferens and through the prostate gland. In the prostate gland, it will become seminal fluid. It's mixed with all kinds of ions as well as enzymes and nutrients, and that will be what is ejaculated. This orgasm is under the sympathetic nervous system control and is very brief. On the female side, stimulation is also under both sensory as well as mental stimulation. Interestingly, the desire is controlled by testosterone, not estrogen. This is under the influence of the parasympathetic nervous system also. During this time, the clitoris becomes engorged in a situation similar to the male cavernosa. It is nitric oxide mediated. Lubrication is provided by Bartholin glands, which are also present for the female. And the orgasm, which is under sympathetic control, results in the rhythmic contractions of the vagina that will help assist the sperm to enter the cervix. If this works, then you actually have a child that will be born, and then the species moves on and continues to reproduce and live. I hope this has given you an overview of human reproduction. As always, if you enjoy science and medicine, you feel free to subscribe or to like this video, and I will be back and see you in a little while, and we'll talk about some applications of endocrinology. Thank you very much.